It was very, very nice to have this introduction. I must say that makes it much easier to talk, although also a little bit perhaps, well, I hope that I live up to your experience and your expectations. I've got a few sort of stories I thought I would tell you. And I think we said it would be about 20 minutes or something like that. But I'm also happy to be interrupted and for it to be more kind of a conversation. I don't have like a presentation as such. So I've lived in Kenya for most of my life, actually, most of my adult life. And about 10 years ago, I met Everett actually and Phyllis in the 90s when I was working at the National Museums here. And then I was working in the arts, and I was really interested in the creative community and young people making art back then. Then I went and worked for the Ford Foundation for some time, funding the arts and engaging with arts and creative people around East Africa for several years. And then I got frustrated that I thought that if the kind of change that we were working on, the kind of big change that we wanted as the Ford Foundation, if that was going to happen, then millions of people were going to have to change the way they lived their lives. And that we, the Ford Foundation, we weren't doing a good job at that. So I thought, let me see. So I jumped across and I thought, let me see if there's an opportunity to do interesting work on that side. Can we get people thinking and talking about big ideas? And around that time, there was an election that went wrong here, the 2007-2008 election. And it was a really shocking experience for Kenya. And a lot of people found themselves sort of reeling after a few months, and Kofi Annan came and everything sort of uneasy peace was restored. And the politicians all got what they wanted, actually almost all of them. But millions of young people who'd been kind of turned into soldiers during those few weeks and months were returned exactly where they started. They had nothing to show for it. Big promises were made and none of those promises were kept. And it felt then that that was really a kind of challenge. And it was maybe the first time that we saw the energy of young people released in a sort of scary way, in a sort of fracture in society. And maybe we'll kind of come back to that idea. But so it seemed to me, though, having come from the Ford Foundation, where I was one of several program officers funding really interesting work, that it was not as if young people have no opportunities. It wasn't as if there's nothing for those young people who were turned into soldiers, nothing for them to do. There were actually really interesting and exciting things happening all around the region, but it felt like none of them was ever quite getting to scale. And it felt like what was missing then was the connective tissue between millions of young people who are out of school, who don't go to class, who don't read the newspapers, who don't watch the news, who are really actually living outside of any formal information systems. There wasn't connecting tissue to enable them to learn, I mean, at a very basic level, to learn about those cool projects that we knew existed and those opportunities that were there for them, or also to kind of connect with opportunities and ideas. And it felt like there was a gap there that anyway, that I set out to try and fill with the organization which I still run, called Shujaz. So the challenge we recognized at the time was that, in the absence of those classrooms and newspapers and televisions and news programs, how do you get people to come together around ideas? How can you convene people if you have no convening power? And so we decided to do it with a story. And that was something that came with me from that work I'd been doing with artists and art organizations, the power of a story to get everybody to lean in. And at the time, we decided that the appropriate technology at the time, the ICT of the day, was a comic book. And so here we are, 11 years later. I think this isn't quite the latest one, but this is 120 million copies later. I think we are the biggest, or at least the most widely circulated comic book in the world. So we started with a comic book, and on the back of a comic book, a radio show. And in fact, the radio show presented by the characters in the comic book. And then the opportunity to talk to the characters in the comic book on social media. In fact, that came later because on the first morning that the comic book hit the streets, people started finding the telephone number buried in the back of the comic book and sending messages. sending messages to the characters, hopefully by text. And so we realized that there was a conversation happening instantly. So fast forward 10 years, we're now, Shujaz, this thing is now the biggest youth brand in Eastern Africa. And we've got a regular audience of about 9.2 million. And in 2020, we engaged 71% of all 15 to 24-year-olds in Kenya. So I have a friend who works for Radio 1. He's the controller of Radio 1 for the BBC in Britain, which is, and BBC Radio 1 is like the youth station for the UK. And underneath his signature, it says, he goes, BBC Radio 1 reaches 43% of British youth. So whenever I write to him, I write, well, Shujaz, we reach 71 now, 71% of Kenyan youth. And we don't get 90 million quid from the taxpayer. We don't get any money from the taxpayer. We have to go and find our funds. But nevertheless, we've somehow or other, Shujaz is now this massive, massive, massive brand. And probably, I mean, we haven't, anyway, so up there somehow. So we started off as kind of storytelling evangelists. We thought that all we need to do is to tell a great tale and let that story be about important things, big things. But if we tell it well and we make it easily available, then people will lean in, surely. And if they lean in, things will stick, because everybody remembers that great school teacher who was just a better storyteller. And that was the bar. We said, let's be that great storytelling teacher. So we invented some characters, we made it relevant. We got the language right. So we work in Sheng, which is, in Kenya at least, we work in Sheng, which is the kind of the smudge of English and Swahili and lots of ethnic languages that young people speak. And then we make it very available. So free inside the Nation newspaper initially, but also through M-Pesa kiosks. And actually today we have almost 5,000 volunteer distributors who are young people with a pool table or a video den or a barber shop. And each of them receives a bundle of comics from us each month. And then they distribute them to their customers. And they get something from that. They get some social capital from doing that. And that's their reward. They become someone in the community. They're the person who just, and then that creates some sort of positive energy. And maybe we can talk about that as well. So having started as evangelists, quite quickly we thought, we can't assume that this is working. We can't assume how it works. We need some data. And so we started measuring things. And we started hiring some researchers. And now we have a team of about 60, I think. And we have an operation in Kenya and in Tanzania. And we have at least 10, I think, in our research team. And we measure everything we can find. We try and track it. And that indeed has led to some interesting things. And we'll talk about those too in a minute. But along the way, we started thinking about how it's possible for a story actually to create change. What happens? How does an idea leap from this piece of paper and become material in somebody's life? And so we really started digging into our theory of change. And I think 10 years later, we're on about version 15 of our theory of change. And there's another one coming. But we started trying to unpick this. How can a story jump from a piece of paper? What's happening in the audience that causes them to react? Because react they do. And we can talk about that as well. And there was a kind of key moment, I think, in that turned out to be very, very important for us, which was a trip to a small town in Western Kenya called Bomet, which is about 4 hours west of Nairobi. And we were in the sort of main town. Bomet is the main town in the county of Bomet. And we were in the pub called the Golf Hotel. There's no golf course anywhere near the Golf Hotel, as far as I can see. It's a sort of big, relatively modern establishment. And we were holding focus groups with young people in the empty pub at the bottom of the Golf Hotel. And after the young people from these focus groups left, the bar manager came over to us and asked us what we were doing. And we were there because the Gates Foundation had asked us to raise the contraceptive prevalence rate amongst 15 to 19-year-olds. And so in order to do that, we thought we'd better go and talk to some 15 to 19-year-olds. So we went to RBurnet and we had these focus groups, and the barman came over, the manager, and said, "What are you up to?" And we said, "This is our challenge." He said, "That's quite interesting." He said, "I have 21 waitresses who work for me on different shifts, on different days." And he said, "All of them are single mothers. Everyone, all the 21 girls, they've all got a baby at home." And we said, "Well, there you have it. That's exactly the thing we're trying to understand." We said, "Could you get your waitresses to use contraception? Would you be able to do that?" And he said, yeah, that's no problem." So he said, "Okay, what's the trick?" He said, "It's easy. I just promote them." So we asked him to explain it a bit more. And so he told us how. He said, "Most of the girls who come and work here, they're living in crisis." He said that the money they're earning today, they've already spent it. So when they come in and they're wiping tables and they're taking away the empty glasses, he said they've got nothing. So if the customer they're serving says, "Should we go home?" they're probably going to say yes. They've got no agency. They're living in a state of crisis. But he said the same girl, the moment she steps behind the counter, and now she's the cashier, and she's taking the money, and she's writing the receipts. He says the same girl, the moment she steps behind the counter, she starts using contraception. And she makes the choice somewhere in her subconscious, because suddenly she feels like she's got one foot on the bottom rung of a ladder that leads to somewhere better. And the change in her subconscious when she sees that ladder in front of her changes entirely the way she sees herself and she sees the future. And it explains something profound to us, because the research we're doing, we've done these annual cross-sectional surveys every year now for 5 years, was telling us that access to modern contraception amongst our target audience is over 70%. In Kenya, it's almost 90% in RBurnet. And knowledge of modern contraception is also over 70, 80% for most of the country. So actually the knowledge and access problems have been solved, but usage is down in the low 20s at best. So the problem of contraception isn't anything to do with the practicalities. It's to do with the motives, actually. It's the motivation. Why would I? What have I got to use it for? As the pastor who we spoke to on that same day in RBurnet said, he says, "We're very friendly people in RBurnet." He said, "If someone comes with a baby, we'll look after it. Maybe a baby will make life better. But a girl with a plan, a girl who feels that tomorrow will be better than today, she's suddenly that knowledge and access that she has makes sense to her." So we started thinking about this idea of agency, and we started thinking about how we could be responsible for that. And so we told a story in the comic book about a girl who comes to Nairobi, and it's a true story actually, who wrote to us, and she comes to Nairobi, and she's been reading a story in the comic book about how to run a small business. And she wrote to the DJ, she wrote to the character in the comic book, and she said, "Thanks for the story I've been reading. Thanks to this, my business has tripled." And so somebody on the desk that day, and we get about sometimes 100,000 text messages a week, so we can miss a lot of them, but somebody caught that one and called the girl back. And we went and interviewed her, and she explained that she'd come to Nairobi from Busia, which is on the Uganda border. And she was 21 years old, and now she was living in Ruaraka, which is a tough part of town. And she said that she'd been surviving since she arrived in town by selling hard-boiled eggs to construction workers. So we call that a teaspoon hustle, the absolute kind of entry-level hustle. But she said that what she discovered by following the story we'd made was that if she made kachumbari, which is onion, tomato, and chili, and if she offered kachumbari as a sort of side salad next to the hard-boiled eggs she was selling, her sales of hard-boiled eggs to construction workers tripled. It went from 1 tray of eggs per day to 3 trays of eggs. And she was delighted with this because she'd got the idea somehow from reading a story in the comic book. So we then told her story in the comic book. But as we went along, as the interview we did with her for the radio show we were making concluded, the girl who was the presenter of the radio show got this whole story about Kachambari. And then the last question she asked, she said, have you got a baby, Winnie? Or have you got a boyfriend? Or have you got a husband? Have you got a plan for a family? And Winnie said, she said, right now, a baby right now, when I've got this thing that's going so well. She said, I'm bulletproof. I'm bulletproof. That was the line, right? That was the end of the interview. So it turns out we just had this experience in RBurnet where we'd heard this story about the barmaid. And then we published this story in the comic book. We heard this girl say, I'm bulletproof. And this turned out to be the most powerful contraception story we've ever run. And in fact, ever since then, we've been running a campaign to raise contraceptive prevalence rate in our media without mentioning contraception at all. And I think we've increased usage of at least condoms by 44%, something like that, amongst our 7.7 million Kenyan users. And we got there without talking about contraception. I mean, we mention it, of course, in passing. We say I'm bulletproof, but that's as close as we get because our audience knows what that means. They don't need a lecture. They don't need a billboard. They need a reason to use it. And it turns out that that girl, Winnie from Busia, who's arrived in Nairobi with nothing, and actually that's a very teachable moment for a young person who's left home behind, has left those networks and ties behind, is living in the city on her wits. It's a very teachable moment. And then she says, I've got this thing I'm doing. So we start to see how a story like that kind of builds and builds, and our audience walk alongside. And the fact that she's from RBurnet, the fact that she's from Busia, the fact it's a true story is all part of that theory of change. We start to understand that the first ingredient we have to get right is trust. And so our comic book, because we use Sheng language, because we make it available in the kiosk where you get your hair cut, because the characters we draw and the stories we put are real stories based on real people, our audience starts to walk alongside those stories. Because we hold the mirror as close as we possibly can to the reality that we see of our fans, we build trust. And we measure it all the time. How do we score on trust? Do our audience believe it? Do our audience refer to it? Will our audience ever use Shujaz as a means to check a fact or to win an argument? And that trust turns into the desire to belong. And I think this is a piece of work we're really interested in at the moment, this idea about belonging and ultimately then identity. So actually the story of the girl with the eggs, as much as anything, is an invitation for young people to be like her. It's an invitation to say, you can do this. If I can do this, if I can come to Nairobi and leave my family behind and start a business selling hard-boiled eggs and triple my sales, and now I'm even thinking about hiring an employee, and I've got to, if I can do that, so can you. And we invite you to join us. We invite you to join us in this new journey, this new identity. Oh, and by the way, we hang contraception onto that identity. So the identity is the modern hustler, the modern young Kenyan hustler. Welcome, you can be one too. And we hang the behavior of contraceptive use onto that. And the result of that, well, a 44% increase in contraception use, but also an almost 40% increase in income. So actually, over the last 3 years, we've been working with the University of Tulane, a professor there called Paul Hutchinson, and we've been running a longitudinal panel study with a cohort of our fans. And we find that on average, our highly engaged fans are earning about $21.90 more per month than non-fans, right? So in a panel study with regression analysis, you can get a fairly accurate, not quite causality, but correlation. And it's worth $140 million a year. So the value of all those young people making a better decision because they relate to the idea of a hustler, because they have an invitation to belong to that group. It increases income, well, across a few million people, it's $140 million a year. But on top of that, there's an impact on years spent in school, because suddenly girls aren't getting pregnant, and therefore they're not dropping out of school. And actually the age of first pregnancy creeping up by a couple of years in our audience. You're 3 times less likely to be married now if you're a member of the Shujaz audience. And these are all kind of building around this idea of I have control of my life. I think I know what to do tomorrow. I think I can picture how tomorrow will be better than today. And the moment I believe that to be true, I start to change my behavior. And we see it happening over and over and over again. So I've taken 20 minutes. I'm only halfway through. This is terrible. I don't know, Everett, would you like me to continue? I have a couple more ideas. Or shall we stop there and unpack?
No, please continue, I would say. And if it goes over 10 o'clock, those who have to go can drop, but those that can stay will be.
Okay, I've got like 2 more points I wanted to make. So one of these things, so we started getting really interested in the idea of hustling. And actually how hustling is a quick fix, actually, that the hustler mindset is a fix that unlocks so many things, right? All these things around contraception, around income, around likelihood of voting, around savings, around earnings. I mean, we've got data on all of this, right? These are all these kind of snowball of good stuff that happens when you start to play with people's perception of themselves. The locus of control, self-efficacy, there's a number of measures that we use. But also looking at the idea of the hustler in the context of modern Kenya, in the context of modern Africa. So last year, in fact, for the last 5 years that we've done a national cross-sectional survey, less than 10%, nearer 4% of those entering the job market have found a formal job. So 90+% of those entering the job market in Kenya and in Tanzania are never going to find a formal job. And yet the school system, the education system, the social system, the family pressure, everyone is saying, go to school, go to college, keep your nose clean, do well, work hard, graduate, there's a job waiting, and there isn't. It's a trap. And actually, so that the contract's broken. The promise that society has been making all these years is broken. And there isn't a new one yet. Grandma sold the cow to pay for my school fees. How can I tell her that all I've got is this certificate in biochemistry? How can I go back and tell her that? So, and there's a trap, and the name for it is cruel optimism. And there's a professor in Chicago who's written about this. So this cruel optimist trap, because I had this promise and I'm holding on to it, surely something will change. Surely that job is going to land in my lap. And so the outcomes, if you sort of follow the literature, is about, well, either I stand still in paralysis, I don't know what to do, I make no decisions, I just live in the moment, which is largely what we're seeing. Or the other outcome is that you start to turn back the clock until you find a time when things worked for people like me. And pretty soon you're in Al-Shabaab now, or you're in Boko Haram, throw the books away. Or you're in, I'm afraid you're in Make America Great Again, when the coal mines, surely, right? Or Brexit. So I think that actually what we're seeing in East Africa is a global crisis, that this contract is broken, that the whole pathway of education is spewing out graduates or candidates for whom there's no work. So in Kenya, at least, in East Africa, it's the informal sector that's picking those people up. It has to. And actually, we start to see something quite powerful there, which is some sort of post-capitalist model so we've been asking young hustlers, how will you know when you've been successful? And the answer we get overwhelmingly is when I become a mentor. It's not when I can drive out of the slum in the car, because there's no money, there's no expectation of money. But actually, there's this idea of social capital as well as financial capital. And actually, we think we start to see our audience have embraced that. And they're already organizing themselves in that way, where social capital is the outcome in addition to financial capital. And that's why they're so keen to distribute comic books for us. As one of the things that makes them into somebody. I need this for my story, the story I'm telling myself, which is the only story that matters. So we did an experiment with this to say, well, I was going to talk a little bit about data, because I think that's also, so it's like the end point of our current work. So I'll try and go quickly through that, and then I'll stop and then we can talk. But we started, one of the things we realized we had, which we could measure, when we wanted to know, are people on the way? Is the journey underway? Have we got inside people's heads? Are they starting to think differently about themselves? Because the action we might be measuring is way down there. But how do we measure changes in attitude that precede action? And so we started analyzing language online. And we started saying, well, if people are talking differently, would that give us hope? Would that give us an early indication that change is coming? So in order to do that, we had to work with some wonderful people from Cambridge University to teach a computer there how to speak Sheng so that we could understand these hundreds of thousands of messages we were getting. And then we started, so then we could sort of parse these messages and we could say, well, are they on topic? If we introduce a topic today in our media, do people start talking about it in a kind of causal way because they weren't talking about it before and now they are? And then does the sentiment change? So can we measure sort of from negative to positive? And we discovered we could do this very well. And then we actually mapped what was happening in the kind of verbal discourse with what we could see in the panel study to say, well, is there a correlation? So do changes in the way people talk map onto changes in the way people behave? And yes, we can see that. But we went back to that data more recently and we said, well, what else can the language tell us? Can the language tell us which of our fans are hustlers? Can we pick out anything about, because if you meet a gang of young hustlers on the street corner, you chat to them for 10 minutes, very quickly you know which ones are going to be the successful ones because of the way they talk. It's their attitude. So we thought, can we detect that if we look for it in language patterns? So we ran some huge experiments, millions of messages, hundreds of thousands of young people. And we started looking at, and then we did it all randomly and in anonymous data. And then we de-anonymized the data and we went and surveyed people and visited them. We discovered there's actually language can tell us who the high-performing hustlers are, the language they use online, with an extremely high degree of accuracy, like 80%. So then we went to the bank and we said, are you interested in high-performing hustlers, young entrepreneurs, young hustlers? And the guy at the digital division at Equity Bank, biggest bank he goes, those people are the whole world. And we said, fantastic. What products have you got for them? And he said, we don't have any products for them. He said, our problem is we can't see them. We know they're out there, but we can't see them. And we can't see the ones who are high potential or the ones who are fraudsters. And so as a consequence, everybody pays for the total risk of the total population. So we're going, well, what if we could bring you the ones who are high performers? Would you be interested in them? If we could prove to you that they're not going to let you down? So that's where we're going now, is to say, actually, the data that these young people have, the data they carry is an asset to them when it's managed in their interests. Right now, it's an asset to Paul Zuckerberg. What's his name? Mark Zuckerberg. But actually, it ought to be an asset to the young people who generate it. Because when we aggregate it and process it, it becomes incredibly valuable. And some people are high-performing hustlers. Some people are high-performing farmers. Some people just need to know when it's their time to go to the clinic, because we can also tell, it seems, what stage in a reproductive health journey young people are on from the way they talk. So with permission, and I think that's incredibly important that we do this in a way that we protect the ownership and the ethics of the data asset itself. But with permission, we think we've found an asset that belongs to young people and that actually can turn anonymous youth into high performers who can have services delivered to them in a far more efficient and productive way than they could before. And so we're building that right now as a new endeavor. So we have Shijaz, and then we have this new thing we're calling Mesh, which is a digital community intended to unlock the value of people's data and their networks. And I think that's me, finished for now. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic, Rob, fantastic. The floor is open. Comments and questions from the group. Yes, Keith.
Okay.
Then Keith.
You first.
Sorry. Rob, fabulous. Thank you. I'm not enough paper to cover it. Two quick questions. When you are generating a story, are you now able to have control over generating that? Or are you, what appeared to be as though somewhat controlled by donors when they said, first of all, gates on contraception?
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, how long do you continue this story? Is it forever ongoing, or do you stop and then pick up on another one? I presume you have many which are running in parallel, but what's the sort of
Mm.
the
Yeah.
lifespan?
So,
Rob, what
yeah.
I'm going to do is just take a number of questions.
Yeah,
and then
good.
I'll come back to you. Yes. Katie, did you finish what you wanted to say? I didn't, I saw you
No,
had,
I just raised my hand like many others, so I can wait or
go ahead,
ask.
after you.
I also have two questions. One is really similar to Keith's. I just wanted to know, I mean, it is a sort of, in a substance sense, where precisely, I mean, I know Shujaz does much more than talk to young people about contraceptive and economic self-reliance. There's an absolute range of things that you have taken up, and I guess the question is, yes, that one of, is it coming from your obviously incredible engagement with your Shujaz readers, or is it coming from donors? How do you balance it? How do you deal with a brand new thing of COVID, and washing hands and whatever else may come along in a health way, in quite an emergency way? And yes, and how do you deal with the stories about the problems that the readers somehow are never going to be, they're just not going to be the ones that are going to tell you? I mean, there may be real problems, but they're not ones that readers would necessarily articulate to you because they're deeply cultural. I mean, or something, violence against women. I mean, maybe that isn't, if people grow up with things they're not necessarily looking for solutions to. So that's one question. And the other one is, how do you do the last mile of, in your M&E, of kind of causality? Because you were saying, oh, we've been able to map, enormous correlation between readership and change. But can you do that last piece where you attribute and you really can say, this was all Shujaz or some Shujaz and some, anyway, it's not a very interesting question. I'm just really interested in that last piece of overlap between change and where you guys pat yourselves on the back, quite rightly, for that change.
Great. Thank you very much. That's a great question as well. Jim, next.
So I think mine correlates to that. So the issue is if the dream of getting an education and having a degree or a certificate and then nothing for them to do, if that's a dead end on the typical educational screen that we've all been taught is the true answer to everything everywhere, where do the hustlers go? What does this, if you create these very large groups of hustlers, where does that lead them, so that if they're successful at their individual business, where do they go? And what does that, how does that turn into a different world and a better world for the people in the audience? And then the other thing is, how does that affect this, the other things that are happening in the society, politically, economically, and even to environment and to the and food security and all the way into peace and things that these societies need. So just love to have that, understand that where this goes and what is the correlation to the other big issues. I'm sure you have answers to that.
Thank you very much, Jim. Fred.
Sorry, yeah, a quick comment and then a question, a provocative question. The comment is, this sounds so fantastic. It sounds really inspiring. And it reminds me a little bit on a new scale and in a different time frame of the efforts in Afghanistan in the precursor to the Civil War, during the time of the warlords, when the BBC supported Afghan expatriates to do radio soaps to try and reach with social messaging communities that were otherwise cut off. It's like a similar thing. You found an audience to listen to the messages via a really interesting medium that they find relevant. The comment, a little bit provocative, is on your example of talking to the bank about finding loan products for the hustlers. And I'm wondering, doesn't that in the end, maybe this is a corollary to what Jim is asking, segment the population of your 7.2 million readers? Instead of trying to find solidarity savings for all of Kenya's youth, you're selecting out that 2 or 3% that are real hustlers and giving them access to credit that will allow them to reach the middle class, perhaps. Is there any thought about trying to find socially oriented solutions based on shoe jazz? And by the way, I'm a big fan, so thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. And I told you, Rob, this would be easy questions. Peter, did you raise your hand?
If I may, great, Rob, and real fan of what you've done for many years, you know, from SIF and Gates onwards. So thanks for that. I'm sort of build on Fred and others' comments, but it's around the segmentation, but maybe with a slightly different slant, is that can you segment the population into categories of the most vulnerable, those without the agency? So, you know, married girls under 16, children on the streets outside family care, children in institutions, those with less agency, disabled, or some form of physical, mental challenge, so that we look at the most vulnerable and how we can use all these wonderful ideas and make sure that we're targeting and or linking them to existing government mechanisms of social protection or other safety nets. But I just wonder how available it is to do that segmentation and look at the bottom quantiles and not just the top.
Fantastic. Niels.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Fantastic. I've heard about it before and fabulous what can be done. When they reach progress, do they discriminate against the lower ones, as Peter was talking? And there I'm particularly, as Peter was mentioning also, the issue of those living with mental conditions and syndromes, how they are excluded and so on. The other, which is more a comment, in Latin America, the criminality is the most efficient at adolescent development. They attract them, they give them a sense of mission, they give them the tools, they train them, they send them out of mission, and when they come back from the mission, they make them feel part of that group. And I think we need SUJAS in Latin America as well.
Thank you very much, Niels. Krishna, did you have
a
question?
Thank you, Everett. Well, wonderful talk, Rob. Congratulations for this great work. It's amazing how you have moved on from Ford Foundation to go into real leadership, mobilization, and vision, and leading to, I would call it a development, innovative model out there that hopefully will be replicated as well. I work with several youth groups in Nepal, so I'll pick on your ideas and perhaps have a chat with you in the future. But one question I have is what is the institutional, organizational structure behind it? Of course, the leadership is there, thinking is there, but what is the system there that got it started and made it, working and going forward? I think that part did not come out clearly, so I'm curious. Thank you.
Great.
Claudio, did you indicate? You're muted.
Just a quick question. Do you have a creative team that writes the story book about these things, and how frequently do you put out one of these comic books?
Great question.
Now I'm going to add one more question, and that is, Rob, if you could, what do you see as the principles or the applicability of this approach in other places? It's very, as was mentioned and as you've talked about, it's very rooted in the experience of Kenya. What have you learned about the general applicability of the strategy?
Yeah.
And with that, over to you.
Is that all? Really? Okay, so I'll try and touch on all these things quickly. So Keith and Katie asked about editorial control. It's a theme. So when we started out, we were very opportunistic, and we would work for virtually anyone who was willing to engage us. And I think, but since then we've become much more sort of strident, and we've set ourselves our own goals, which is done in a very collaborative way with our team, and we're about something like between 50 and 60, I think, and the average age is in the 20s. So we try and hire people who come from our audience. So the things we're working on at the moment are agency, well, yeah, we call it agency, financial fitness, and health. So these are our 3 initiatives. Agency also looks a bit like participation. So there's a bit of governance in there. The elections are coming, so we're thinking about that. So everything we do fits within those 3 things. And then we go and we offer our services and our strategies to potential partners. But the one thing we absolutely don't give is any editorial control. So we'll agree a plan based on outcomes. And we don't offer our partners any access at all, or in any way, to the process or the methodologies we're going to use. So it has to fit our own intentions, and we have our own quite elaborate kind of set of indicators that we set internally before we speak to anyone else. These are the things we hope to try and do this year. This is the outcomes we'd like to achieve. Then we go looking for people to work with, and we don't allow them into the machine. They have nothing to offer. Because our creative, and maybe this is to Claudio's question, our creative is done by a team of young people who are given insights and are given a target by our knowledge and learning team, who've gone out and done formative research, who've understood where people stand, who've unpacked this theory of change. And we're saying, well, in order to get our young people from where we think they are now to this place we'd like to get them to with them, how are we going to do that? What's the story we're going to create that's going to get us there? So the characters in the story, and this is maybe also to Keith's question, the characters in the story have been the same for 10 years. There's a radio DJ who is also a sort of vlogger online. There's a young girl and a young boy. There's an urban, a rural, an upcountry, a coastarian. So we tried to create these different segments, these different characters who would all carry a part of the audience with them. And then around them, we've discovered real young people want to participate too. So about 50% of everything we do is actually just told to us by our fans. And then we tell those stories back to the audience. And that's really powerful when we blur and blend our fictional stories, where we can put drama and hilarity, because everyone has to be entertained, but we mix them together with really poignant true stories, which are extremely good. There's a whole thing about role models and the mental models that come with role models. Maybe that's for another day. So Katie asked about stories that are never told. I think we've become quite good at listening, and I think we've got a really wonderful team who are really good at listening and trying to hear the kind of nuances. And I think this gets to Peter's question about the kind of bottom quintile. I told this story to Everett the other day. We met a guy, a young man in a focus group, who told us that he'd been a thief until a few months earlier in Kawangware, a slum in Nairobi. And he lived at home with his mum and his 6 siblings. And he'd been arrested on a Saturday afternoon while planning a robbery. And he'd spent the night in the police station. And in the morning, he went home and he found his mother in bits. She was in a state because she'd been robbed during the night. And everything in their house had been taken. And although she had never once spoken to the boy about the fact that she knew he was a known thief, she was suspicious that he might have been responsible for this crime. So he said, no, I slept at my friend's house. She kind of dragged him to the friend's house. His story fell apart. And at that point, he was confronted by the loss of the faith of his mother, which is ultimately something we realize is that that's the most precious, the most pure thing in the lives, even of the roughest gangster, his mum's love. And so at that point, he kind of fell on his knees and he begged for forgiveness. And he admitted that he was the thief, but he hadn't been the one who robbed mum's house. And he turned over a new leaf. And he told us on the way he'd learned 3 things in life. He said that there are 3 teams, he said. Team 1 is full of people who do bad things in the open. He said that was the team he was in. Team 2, he said, are people who say good things and appear to do good things, but they're just trying to use you. And team 3, he said, we build each other, tunajengana. And he said, I'm now in team 3. And he said, you guys, you Shujaz guys, you're in team 3. But I think the point there is that, so we went home and did an audit to say, are we in team 3 all the time? How often are we in team 2? How often are we pursuing a number or a point on a spreadsheet that a client or a donor of ours has funded us to achieve? And actually, we're just pursuing that. That's taken over from our intent to improve the lives of our fans. So we have a term, we call it player first. So player first is this idea that we must always be in team 3. We've got to serve the audience first. But also what we've come to realize, and maybe this is to Peter's point, is that sometimes all we can do is be empathetic and be in team 3. But sometimes all people need is to know that we feel them, that we see them. Sometimes actually that what we realize is the power of the brand, and there's a whole thing about how brand correlates with impact. The power of the brand is the fact that we feel people. And sometimes we met 2 girls in Naivasha last year who were just, it was the most awful situation. And there was, every time we said, have you tried this? They could, no, we can't, had a reason why not. But in the end, the reason they felt that we were real is because we felt them, we had empathy. The storyline kind of captured their reality. And that gave them agency. It gave them a belief that they're not out there, they're not completely forgotten. Sometimes that's all we can do, but actually that's powerful, it turns out. It gives people a sense of hope. Now, that said, we can also do stuff, Peter, with disability storylines. We've been doing some stuff on assistive technology this year. Can we model the role of disabled people in public life? Can we put them in the public gaze? Can we tell stories about them? So we went and worked with loads of people who are working in disability in Nairobi, and we told real stories, both in fiction and in reality in our story world, to try and break that kind of silence about disability. And you can suddenly surface a role model who happens to be. So and I think we're really good at that, because it turns out that these paper comic books filter all the way to the bottom of society. The place we're very bad at going is sort of pastoralists who don't speak Swahili or Sheng. Then we're not good there. But in almost all other communities, we're pretty saturated. And in Tanzania too. And I haven't talked about Tanzania, but we also have Shujaz in Tanzania. So the dead end dream, it's true. Okay, so this is a big one, right? I think this is where we have to imagine society in 10 more years. I mean, that's what we've been trying to do in our team. In 10 more years, when there are another, when the youth population has doubled again, what's society actually going to be like? Because it's not going to deliver these sort of 20th century promises. We know that's not going to happen. Kenya added 78,000 new jobs last year and 1 million job seekers. And those 78,000 jobs were pounced on by all the other unemployed people who were older, never mind the new job seekers. So society is going to be profoundly different, I think, in 10 years' time. And it is going to be comprised of 2 worlds, the formal and the informal. But I think there are ways that we can start to blur those. And I think the digital work we're starting to do now enables us to see a world in which the lines are blurred between informal and informal. And people can see across the gap, like the bank, but not only the bank. There's so many organizations that want to see across the line, who can see the energy and the productivity of this massive youth population, but currently can't serve them. So although my example, and the first example that we've researched in depth, has been about linking people to financial services, we see multiple applications for this. Financial services is one, it's easy, right? Because ultimately it's a digital transaction. If you want to provide digital financial services, it can all happen invisibly. But we've also been talking to agricultural input providers to say, well, if you're living on a south-facing slope with red soil and you grow sorghum, there's probably a particular combination of seed and fertilizers that you need. Can we make sure that you get that and not the other type of, can we do better than the current inefficient system to link buyers and sellers and buyers? And we think in future, as the internet becomes more prevalent, that's going to become ever more powerful and ever more useful. The internet usage in Kenya has doubled since 2016. So it's now 48% of our audience say they have access to a smartphone, up from 24% in 2016. So it's going to double again, right? And when it's just a matter of time. Devices are coming down in cost, data's coming down in cost. That one's a foregone conclusion. So in this new society where we have twice as many young people as we have today, how is it going to work? How are people going to be successful? We think it's not going to be, it cannot be defined purely on the pursuit of wealth. We think and we see it already, that young people are defining new terms. That young man who used to be a thief has found a new way to be successful. And it was the catalyst was the near loss of his mother's love. But actually the result is he's found another way to be somebody in Kawangware. And we see that story repeated over and over. Now, I don't know, we can't see it completely, but we see a new language of status. We see new types of badges where people can become someone without a university degree. And actually, there's a whole data piece on that too, about how can that data that young people are accruing become a kind of transversal qualification that allows them to enter new worlds, not because they've got a degree in biochemistry, but because they're a good person who are active in the community, who are respected and trusted and so on. Looking at my notes. We've done some work on, Niels, we've done some work with violent extremism. We've done some work, we've done some thinking about violent extremism in Kenya. And it's very much along the lines of your Latin American gangs. This idea about actually the promise of Al-Shabaab in Kenya is love and belonging. And it's the same things that society, that government in Kenya today are doing a very poor job at delivering. In fact, you could almost argue that the Kenyan are signaling exactly the opposite. That the Kenyan authorities are rejecting young people. They're the mosquitoes who spread COVID. They're a ticking bomb ready to explode. But when we invited the Deputy Minister of Health onto an online interview the other day, 22,000 people in our audience showed up to listen to what she had to say.
Wow.
So there might be a ticking bomb, but they want to engage. But I must say also that I had the opportunity to tell that story and a bunch of other ones to the UN agency chiefs in Kenya yesterday, and they've invited us back. So maybe we'll have an opportunity to convince them there's another way of seeing Kenyan youth. 82% of them say they want to have a positive role in the elections next year. Structure, Krishna. We're set up as a social business. So I decided very carefully not to set up an NGO. We want to provide a service. We want to provide a service and we want to be paid for that service. And that allows us to work for Unilever and Coca-Cola and Safaricom and all these big brands as well. And it allows us to make a profit, but we've capped our profit. But the profit gets divided amongst the people who work on the project. And that provides them with an enthusiastic excitement of being present. It also actually paid me back for the pension that I spent, my Ford Foundation pension, to get the engine started, because no one believed in the idea at the beginning except me. So I'm a believer in that social business model, where actually, maybe that's a new type of capitalism too, where we can focus on achieving positive social outcomes, but we can also make a profit. But we can do so with a balance. So double bottom line or something they call it. So that's our model. So principles, Everett, I think ultimately I touched on it just now, player first. This idea that the audience genuinely come first. Never team two, always team three. If I could distill that and package it, that to me is that's the secret sauce of Shujaz. We genuinely stand as close to our audience as we possibly can. We measure our success on the outcomes that we define with our audience. And we try at all costs to stay out of team two, where we see most or many of our development project peers slipping, where they're looking at numbers rather than outcomes. They're looking at an Excel sheet rather than the actual effects of the project on the ground, particularly in the contraception world, where needles stuck in girls' arms becomes the only metric, not whether the girl wanted the needle or whether she'll come back for another one. So I think, to my mind, the idea of player first, the idea of proximity to the audience, and ultimately the idea of agency as the key that unlocks a whole dimension of other possibilities. If we could give a gift to our audience, if I could give a gift to everyone in our audience, it would just be that. It would be agency. Because with agency, young people start to solve their own problems. Of course they do, right? It's what you want in your own children. You want them to be confident. You want them to have a sense that they can manage themselves and their own outcomes. That's all you want for them in the end. And actually, if we can give that, and it seems as if we can, it seems as if we can give people an intrinsic belief that they have the power to make tomorrow better than today. And that's on a huge scale, from the 2 girls in Naivasha who are selling themselves to tourists, through to the thief, through to the high potential young entrepreneur. But as soon as that seed is genuinely felt inside, the girl who's walked behind the bar and now she's got her foot on the bottom rung of a ladder to somewhere better, when they have that seed, they start to make better choices. And those better choices are across the board because they have something to protect. That's the key. And then they solve their own problems thereafter. That's the applicability.
Fantastic. Rob, thank you very much. And simply because of time, we're going to do our last quick round. And let's be very brief, but Niels, would you be first? Final comment?
Thank you so much, Rob. Fantastic. And hope we can collaborate on some of the messaging on topics that are favorite in this group.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Peter, final comment? He may be.
Huge thanks, Rob, and I'll be in touch bilaterally, I'm sure.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, no, thanks. That was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Fred?
Yeah, very inspiring, Rob. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to hearing more.
Thanks. Keith? You're muted. You're muted still.
Yeah, inspiring, Rob. I'm absolutely busting now to be in contact with my colleagues in Sierra Leone. I want to share with them all that you said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Katie?
I thought it was quite mediocre, actually. Really dull sounding project, Rob. Really left me cold. No, April Fool, that was, what can I say? Repeating what everyone else said. It was just fantastic. And it does seem to me that its replicability is, I'm sure you're bothered about this all the time by people around the world, but amazing opportunities in places other than just East Africa to do something. Well done. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And Jim?
So thank you so much, Rob. Very provocative, and always think about these things in terms of partnerships and how they could intertwine with other organizations that we work with as collectively in this group or us individually. And just wondered what your feeling is about partnerships and how this ties into. I asked the question about how this might relate to Gurmeen and Brack, who were written up in the New York Times the other day, talking about a Bangladesh that had been a basket case, had evolved and primarily gave the credit to those 2 big nonprofits or NGOs or whatever they're called, but they're massive. And some of the early criticism was that they help people to survive and be healthy and have something, but there wasn't much of a ladder beyond the level that they were at. They got people from destitution into stability, and so I remember that in questions to to members of the leaders of both of those organizations. So I just wonder. I mean, I don't know if you try to answer that now, but I'd love to have an email from you and love to know what your feeling is for collaboration, not just with big organizations like that, but I have a client called Peace Tech Lab in Washington, which is an outgrowth of U.S. Institutes of Peace. So they're really interested. They're working in Kenya and in many other places with the same kind of groups of people you are. And I'd love for you to have a conversation there with the leader of that. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, the whole issue of cure violence. So the last comment you made, the Cure Violence Global, I think there could be some really interesting conversations there, but I don't know what your interest is in partnerships and promulgation and so forth.
I mean, just to say, we're extremely interested in partnerships. I mean, it's really the only way we can work. So it's a routine part of our way of working. So I'd be very interested in both those conversations. And I think I know a little bit about the Cure Violence Global. I think I once met somebody from that organization at an event. So I'd be very interested. I'm not very familiar with the Grameen and Braque storylines. So if there's a particular article in the New York Times, I'd love I'll look for it. Or if you could send me a link, that would be brilliant.
Okay. It was an op-ed piece about last week sometime, but I'll find it and send that to you.
Thank you.
Soda meeting. Final comment?
Yes, thank you. I'm sure it sounds like you're going to be busy with a lot of bilaterals, and I have one too, because as Keith knows, there's some young people in Sierra Leone I'm in touch with, and they're interested in, they know about and they're interested in Sujaz. I was following up while we were on the call. I'm interested also in the storytelling modality for change, and you talked about how your theory of change has gone through an evolution. I'm so interested, love to know more about that and how, you know, that tells its own story. And also on what I think Catherine mentioned a little bit about the agency of girls and women in particular and protection from the sexual vulnerability and violence. So lots, so much to say. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for your interest, everyone. Yeah.
Audio.
Thank you, Rob. I lived in Kenya from 87 to 95, and the diagnostic you made about the situation of youth and the dead end and the chimney not pulling up was as much at that time as it seems to be today, and as you are prognosing, it's going to be in 50 years' time. I work for the Ministry of Health and for UNICEF, and basically, I think that the avenues that you are opening are very important. Interestingly enough, I have not followed up very much of what's happened in Kenya since then, and I was not aware of your project. So it's a real great opportunity for me to find out what you guys have been doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Krishna.
Thank you, Rob. I hope to see you someday in Nepal.
Ah, yes. I know Nepal well. That would be great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll talk.
Yeah, I did a feasibility study for Sujaz in Nepal, and it seemed like it was like the perfect context.
Have some groups I can connect you with that.
Everywhere is. That's slightly the challenge. And
Yep.
so now we just need the millions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of people or of money?
Both. The people come. The money is a bit more challenging, we find, but the people seem to come. I mean, actually, so I think where the digital piece for us. So Sujaz, 10 years old. We've made it work in Kenya and Tanzania. The circumstances appear to be very, very, I mean, quite different culturally, actually. But in terms of the way we were able to trigger young people, Tanzania has been an even bigger success from an audience point of view, not including Mr. Magufuli. But if you take the audience point of view, it's been a bigger success in Tanzania than it has in Kenya. So we're very, very encouraged that this model, this swinging the beam round really onto young people and helping them achieve what they want to achieve and finding a way to put them first is such an exciting offer for young people that it has real resonance. So Nepal, Ethiopia, there's a few other places where we've looked, but we haven't cracked the financial model. It costs quite a lot, all this paper, damn it. But digital, we also think is potentially really exciting because we think we can actually take our theory of change into this digital space. And then there's a whole other potential business model that goes to scale. So a lot of our emphasis now is on this digital thing, Sujaz Mesh, we call it, perhaps for another day, which we think actually might really just go whoosh and it can stand on ethical commercial money rather than on development money. So that's a lot of my effort is going in there. Can we make it work? Don't know. We have to stay alive for a few more months to find out.
So, Rob, I can't hesitate. I mean, I can't keep from telling you this quickie. Many things that have been done by philanthropists in places give them a particular vision for that place. So a couple of years I was executive vice president of the Touch Foundation, which was put together in its current form by a senior partner at McKinsey. And it was about training doctors so that they could then train the thousands and hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers that are needed to help that country be. And it's been a really booming success. But from your perspective, what the board I built there did was it put, a dozen top American financial executives on a board that actually went there and saw Baganda and saw what happened, met the people, and gave of their own money. So if, just what occurred to me is that there is a cell of people that primarily from New York City, but institutionally really spread out, that have an understanding of Tanzania and the people there, and have sort of fallen in love with those students. Now that's a different type of education. That's the traditional piece that it doesn't make the promise. But in that case, there were many jobs for those doctors. There were, there were plenty of jobs for the people that they produce, and unlike some of the other things. But it just, so there are, I just want to make the point that there are Americans who have a special understanding of the problems you're working with, that have happened over the last 5 to 10 years. The Carter Center, which I spent many years working at, is another educator of people about Africa and about societies. So I just think that's something that you should think about, is that there are people who know, and that they might be people you should be in touch with.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps
Well,
they think they know. Perhaps they think they know and not know.
Well, I would certainly say that there are lots of different kinds of people out there, but just like in all these situations, what you're going after are the people that actually do know or have something you could use if you educated them better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I must say, a lot of our support is coming from the US anyway. Mostly through the sort of well-known kind of big, the Gates and Hewlett and so on. But there's no reason to doubt that there are many others. So I think we're here in Kenya, so sometimes we might not be in the right places and having the right conversations. If anyone thinks there are some particular people we should be talking to, then that would be very good news for us. So
I was looking for your email, but I'll get your email and send you that story from the New York Times.
Thanks a lot.